My father called me on a Tuesday evening, which should have been my first sign that something was off. He never called on Tuesdays. Tuesdays were when he watched his history documentaries and didn't want to be disturbed by anyone, including his children. So when his name lit up my phone screen at 7:43 p.m., I actually stared at it for a full 3 seconds before answering. "Leah," he said, skipping hello entirely. "I need you to come to dinner on Saturday. Your brother's bringing his girlfriend's family. It's important." My brother Colin had been dating Serena Ashworth for almost 2 years. I'd heard about her parents exactly once. My mother mentioned that her father was a federal appellate court judge and her mother sat on the board of 2 hospital systems. My parents had been quietly terrified of this dinner for months. "Okay," I said. "What time?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that, if you've grown up in my family, you learn to recognize. It means someone is about to say something they've been rehearsing. "I need you to keep things simple," my father said. "Don't make a big deal out of what you do. You know how it is. These are very established people, traditional. We don't want things to get complicated." I set down the mug I was holding. "What does that mean?" "Just introduce yourself as Colin's sister. Keep it at that. You don't need to get into the details of your work." "I'm a trauma surgeon. I've been one for 6 years. Before that, I did a 5-year general surgery residency at Johns Hopkins, then a 2-year fellowship in trauma and critical care. I have performed surgery on people who arrived at my hospital with less than a 20% chance of surviving the night and watched them walk out the door 3 weeks later. This is not something I consider a complication." "Dad," I said slowly, "you want me to hide that I'm a doctor." "Not hide. Just, don't lead with it. These people have a certain image of what Colin's family should look like and I don't want." "What image is that?" Another pause. "Leah, please don't make this difficult. Just come to dinner, be pleasant, and let Colin have his moment. That's all I'm asking." I should have said no. I want to be very clear about that because I know what you're thinking. Why did she go? Why did she sit there and agree to that? And I've asked myself the same thing about 100 times since. The honest answer is that it wasn't really about my father. It was about Colin. My brother and I have always been close in the way that people are when they survive the same household. We didn't always agree, and we'd had our share of years where distance crept in, but when it mattered, he'd shown up for me. He drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to sit with me the night before my boards. He moved boxes into my first apartment when I had a stress fracture in my foot and couldn't carry anything heavier than a water bottle. I loved him, and I knew this dinner was important to him, and my father knew that I knew that, which is why he called me instead of just sending a text. So I said, "Fine. I'll be there." What I did not say was, "I'll be quiet about who I am." That part I just let my father assume. The Ashworths were already at the restaurant when we arrived. My parents had chosen a place called Hargroves, which was the kind of old-money dining room that had dark wood paneling and menus without prices and waitstaff who could tell, with one glance at your shoes, exactly how much you were worth. I'd eaten there twice in my life, both times for hospital donor events. Serena stood up when we came in. She was exactly the kind of woman Colin always fell for. Warm, composed, the sort of person who makes you feel immediately at ease while simultaneously making you aware that she could have been doing something far more impressive. She hugged my mother first, then my father, then me. "Leah," she said, and there was something genuine in how she said it, like she'd been looking forward to meeting me specifically. "I've heard so much about you." I smiled. I wondered what version of me she'd heard about. Her parents were at the far end of the table. Judge Edmund Ashworth. And I knew his name because I had, the night before, done what any sensible person does when they're told to make themselves invisible. I looked up exactly who I was being hidden from. He was a senior judge on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. He'd been appointed in his mid-50s and had a reputation for being precise, demanding, and fair, in a way that apparently made both sides of a case equally nervous. He had silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested he had never once slouched in his entire life. His wife, Patricia Ashworth, was seated next to him. She had a warmth that her husband's formality seemed to balance rather than suppress. She looked at me when I sat down the way people do when they're genuinely curious about you, not sizing you up, just interested. I was placed at the far end of the table. Not in a rude way, not obviously. But the seating arrangement had been handled by my mother, and I noticed that she and my father positioned themselves closest to the Ashworths, with Colin and Serena between them, and me at the opposite end near Serena's younger sister, and a cousin who had apparently come along as company. I was seated between 2 people I'd never met at a dinner where my own family was the one celebrating. I'd been managed. The meal started pleasantly enough. My father did what he does when he's nervous, which is ask a lot of questions and then talk over the answers. My mother focused on Serena with the intensity of a woman who had decided that the future mother-in-law role was her only remaining ambition. Colin was relaxed in the way he always was in public. He had always been better at rooms full of strangers than I was. The Ashworths were gracious. Judge Ashworth asked thoughtful questions about Colin's work. He's a civil engineer, manages infrastructure projects across 3 states, and listened carefully to the answers. Patricia asked my mother about the family, about how long they'd lived in the area, about whether they'd seen any of the new exhibits at the Art Institute. She was the kind of person who made conversation feel like a genuine exchange instead of a performance. I mostly talked to Serena's sister, whose name was Adrian, and the cousin, whose name I've already forgotten, about nothing in particular. I was fine. I had accepted the terms of the evening. I was Colin's sister, here to smile and be pleasant and not complicate things. It was going well, in the specific way that things go well when you've agreed to make yourself smaller than you are. Then Judge Ashworth looked down the table. He'd been talking to my father about something, infrastructure funding I think, or municipal bonds. I wasn't really following, and then he stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at me. The way you look at someone when you've just placed them, when something has clicked. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Dr. Leah Forsyth?" The table went quiet the way tables do when someone says something no one was expecting. I looked at him. "Yes," I said. My father's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Judge Ashworth turned to his wife. "Patricia, it's Dr. Forsyth." Patricia Ashworth turned to look at me properly for the first time, and her expression shifted into something I didn't immediately understand. It wasn't just recognition. It was something more than that. She said, "Oh my God. 3 years ago I was on call on a Friday night in November when a car was brought in, a head-on collision on I-90, 2 vehicles, multiple casualties. Standard chaos. We triaged fast. I remember the particular quality of that night. It had been raining and there were 4 patients arriving at staggered intervals, and my team was already managing 2 critical cases from earlier in the shift. The second car had carried a woman in her mid-60s. Severe abdominal trauma, internal bleeding, BP dropping by the time she was in the bay. The paramedics had done everything right, but she'd lost a lot of time at the scene. By the time she reached my OR, we had maybe minutes of workable window. I don't remember every surgery I've performed. Some blur together, especially the ones that end well. But I remembered that one, because she had looked at me in the brief moment before the anesthesia took hold, and she had said, clearly, deliberately, "I trust you." People say things like that. In that moment, when they're frightened and handing their life to a stranger, they say things like that. But the way she said it stayed with me. She survived. She was in ICU for 11 days and in the hospital for almost 3 weeks, and then she walked out. I saw her at her discharge, which I don't always do. I'm usually back in the OR by then, but something had made me stop by her room before I went in that morning. Her name was Patricia. I hadn't known her last name. I hadn't known her husband was a federal judge. I hadn't known anything about her except that she had said "I trust you" to a stranger in a trauma bay and meant it, and that she had survived the night because the window had been just barely wide enough. I hadn't thought about her often. Thousands of patients. You can't carry all of them. But I had thought about her sometimes, in the particular way you think about the ones where the margin was that thin. She was looking at me from across the table now, and her eyes were bright. "You saved my life," she said. She said it simply, the way you state a fact that is so large it doesn't need decoration. "I was in your hospital 3 years ago, a car accident on the highway. You were my surgeon." The table was completely still. Colin was looking at me. His expression was the one he gets when he realizes he's been missing context that was important. A kind of slow dawning reckoning. My father had put his glass down. Judge Ashworth had turned fully in his chair to face me. Something had changed in his face. The precise formal quality was still there, but underneath it was something I recognized from the families of patients. The look of someone who has thought about a moment from a distance and is now unexpectedly inside it. "I've wanted to know who you were," he said. His voice was different than it had been when he was talking about municipal bonds, quieter. "We were told your name at the hospital, but we didn't find a way to reach out. We didn't know how." He stopped. "You should know that what you did that night, what you gave us, we don't have words for that. We've never had words for that." Patricia reached across the table. I don't know how. The table was wide, but she reached, and I reached back, and she held my hand in both of hers for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I've wanted to say that to you for 3 years. I don't know exactly what happened on my father's end of the table in those few minutes." I was looking at Patricia Ashworth. But I heard my mother make a sound that was something between a gasp and a swallowed word. And I was aware, in the peripheral way you're aware of things when your attention is somewhere else, that my father was very quiet. Colin spoke first. "Dad," he said, and his voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard in a long time. "Did you know Leah was a surgeon?" "Of course I knew," my father said. "Then why did you tell me to seat her at the end of the table?" There was a silence. It was Serena who looked at my father when she said, carefully and clearly, "Did you ask Leah not to mention what she does?" My father said nothing. Colin's jaw moved. Judge Ashworth had been watching this exchange with the attentiveness of a man who had spent decades evaluating how people behaved when they thought the stakes were high. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His expression said it for him, in the particular way that the expressions of people with authority say things without anyone having to voice them. My father cleared his throat. He said something about how he just hadn't wanted to make the evening about any one person, wanted everyone to feel comfortable, hadn't meant anything by it. Nobody at the table appeared to believe him. What I remember most about that moment was not feeling angry. I'd expected to feel angry, if I'm honest. I'd spent the drive over running through various versions of the evening in my head, including some where things went badly, and in most of them there was some version of anger. But what I actually felt, sitting there with Patricia Ashworth's hands wrapped around mine, was something closer to tired. The particular tiredness of having made yourself smaller than you are for so long that you almost stop noticing. I had done it so many times in so many rooms, made myself easier to manage, softened the thing I'd worked hardest to become because it made other people more comfortable. And what I was thinking right then was that I was not going to do it again. Dinner continued. This is the strange thing about significant moments. Life doesn't pause to acknowledge them. The food was still on the table. The waitstaff still came by to refill water glasses. Adrian, Serena's sister, quietly reached over and touched my arm in a way that required no words. Judge Ashworth spoke to me for most of the rest of the meal. He asked about the hospital, about the work, about what had drawn me to trauma surgery specifically. He asked good questions, the kind that suggested he was actually listening to the answers. At one point he said, with the directness of someone who had never once in his professional life been vague on purpose, "You should be enormously proud of what you do. I hope you know that." Patricia told me about her recovery. About the first time she walked without pain. About the trip she and her husband had taken to Portugal the following spring because they'd decided after everything that they were done putting things off. She laughed when she said it. The easy laugh of someone who has come back from something and knows it. Colin was quieter than usual for the rest of the evening. When we walked out to the parking lot afterward, he waited until our parents had moved ahead and then he stopped walking and turned to me. "I didn't know he said that to you," he said. "About not mentioning what you do. I know you didn't. I wouldn't have if I'd known. I wouldn't have let it go on like that. You know that, right?" I looked at him. He meant it. That was the thing about Colin. He had his own blind spots, his own ways of navigating our parents that didn't always serve me. But when he was standing in front of me telling me something, it was true. "Yeah," I said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Patricia Ashworth. You saved her life. A lot of people helped save her life. It's not, Leah." He looked at me. "Stop doing that." I stopped doing that. On the drive home my phone buzzed. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize, and then reading it, I realized it was Serena. "I got your number from Colin. I hope that's okay. I just wanted to say, I've known for a while who my family is, and I've never been anything but proud of them. I want you to know that the Ashworths are the same way. They will not forget tonight, and neither will I." Then, a few minutes later, a second message. "Also, for what it's worth, my father doesn't give compliments the way other people give compliments. When he says he's impressed by someone, it's because he's actually thought about it. He doesn't say things to be polite. You should probably keep that." I read that one twice. My father called me the following Wednesday. The history documentary night, which he apparently abandoned, because he had something he needed to say. He started with the thing people always start with when they've done something they're not willing to fully own yet. He said he hadn't realized how it would look, that he was only trying to make sure the evening went smoothly, that he didn't mean for it to come across the way it did. I let him talk, then I said, "Dad, I need you to hear me say this, even if it's uncomfortable. What you asked me to do wasn't about the evening going smoothly. It was about you being embarrassed by what I do. And I don't know exactly where that comes from, but I need you to know that I'm not going to participate in that anymore. I'm a trauma surgeon. I'm going to say so when people ask. And if that's uncomfortable for you in certain rooms, then we need to talk about that. But the solution is not me pretending to be something less than what I am. There was a long silence. I know, he said finally. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was something. With my father, something is usually where we start. That was 8 months ago. Serena and Colin got engaged in February. It was a small thing. He asked her on a walk in the neighborhood where they'd had their first date. And she said yes before he'd finished the sentence, which he told me later with the specific delighted embarrassment of a man who hadn't quite planned for that. I was happy for them in the simple, uncomplicated way that's possible when something good happens to someone you love. Judge Edmund Ashworth called me once, a few weeks after the dinner. He had found my direct line through the hospital's physician directory. He said he wanted to follow up on something he'd mentioned at dinner. He sat on the board of a foundation that funded trauma care in underserved communities, and they had a grant cycle opening in the spring, and he thought the work my department was doing might be worth putting in front of them. I told him I'd send over the information. He said, "Good." And Dr. Forsyth, for what it's worth, I've sat across from a great many people in my life in professional settings. I've had to make judgments about people's character and their competence. I don't say this often, but I'm saying it now. The room is always better when you're in it and saying so. I think about that more than I probably should. Not because I need the validation. I've been operating long enough that I've learned not to tether my sense of what I do to whether any particular person approves of it. But because there is something that lands differently about being told, specifically, not to shrink yourself, by someone who saw clearly what shrinking had been asked of you. Patricia sends me a message on the anniversary of the accident. She's done it twice now. Just a few lines. That she's well, that she and her husband had a good year, that she still thinks about that night and what it meant. The messages are short and they are enough. I have not been asked since that Saturday in November to introduce myself as anything other than what I am. My father came to a department event at the hospital in March. He stood in the back of the room during the presentation portion, and afterward when one of my colleagues, a resident I'd mentored for 3 years, introduced herself to him as someone who'd trained under me, he said, with a straightforwardness I hadn't heard from him before on the subject, "She's exceptional at what she does." He said it like he'd been saying it for years, like it wasn't something he'd had to work up to. Maybe that's how it starts. You stop asking the people you love to make themselves smaller, and then slowly, you find the words that should have come naturally all along. The table at Hargroves had 47 seats. I was put at the end of it so that I wouldn't take up too much room. I've thought about that sometimes since, about how the instinct to manage someone, to position them where they'll cause the least disruption, almost always backfires. Because people are not furniture. They do not stay where you put them. And the things you try to hide about someone have an irritating tendency to be exactly the things that matter most in the room. I know who I am. I've always known. But there is something specific about having that reflected back to you. Not by a stranger, not by a colleague, but in a room where someone who loved you had tried to make you invisible, that settles into you differently. I walked into that restaurant as Colin's sister. I am Colin's sister. That's real and it matters and I would not trade it. But I also walked out as myself, fully. For the first time in a long time in a room with my family, I walked out as exactly the person I had spent 15 years becoming. That's the part no seating arrangement can take away.